Welcome. I'm David Levi Strauss, chair of the MFA program in art writing here at the School of Visual Arts. Over the past 13 years of the program, we've spent some time at the beginning of each year looking at the journal documents produced by a group of dissident surrealists in Paris from 1929 through 1930. It was edited by Georges Bataille, and one of its main contributors was a poet and critic from Germany named Carl Einstein. We were especially attracted to the magazine because of its critical dictionary entries with their extraordinary combinations of text and images, and we've sought to make our own critical dictionary inspired by theirs over the years. So this rather mysterious figure of Carl Einstein, poet, art critic, anarchist, street fighter, became a kind of daimon of the program. Mysterious because we could never find much of his work translated. At some point, one of my students mentioned him to Deborah Bricker-Balkin, who's been teaching for us for years, and she said, "Oh yes, I know the world's greatest authority on Einstein. His name is Mark Haxthausen." And now we have him here to talk about the hopeless chasm between discourse and image on Carl Einstein's art criticism. Carl Einstein is an extraordinary figure in the history of the relation between art and politics. A writer of poetry, fiction, literary criticism, drama, and politics, the vast majority of his published work is about visual art, and Marx says these writings constitute one of the richest and most intellectually ambitious bodies of European art theory and criticism from the first half of the 20th century. The parallels between Einstein and Walter Benjamin are striking. Einstein committed suicide on the French-Spanish border in 1940, running from the Nazis, 3 months before Benjamin did the same. But there is no indication that either one of them knew the other's works. Mark wrote about the confluences and conflicts among their works in a piece in a special issue of October devoted to Einstein in 2004. I'm very excited to hear what Mark is going to say about Carl Einstein tonight. He's the Robert Sterling Professor of Art History Emeritus at Williams College, where he served as the director of the graduate program in the history of art from 1993 to 2007. This year, he's a Leonard A. Lauder Distinguished Scholar for Modern Art at the Metropolitan Museum. He's written widely on modern and contemporary art and art criticism with a focus on Germany, although his interests also extend to post-1960s American art. Among his many publications are books on Paul Klee, Max Beckmann, Sigmar Polke, Anselm Kiefer, Arakawa Gins, and Sol LeWitt. Since 1996, he has published many articles on Carl Einstein, and his translations with extensive commentary of 14 texts by Einstein will be published next month by the University of Chicago Press as A Mythology of Forms, Selected Writings on Art. There's a sheet at the door back there you can take and get 20% off. Please welcome Charles W. Mark Haxthausen.
Thank you very much, David. I really appreciate this invitation. It seems to me a perfect venue to talk about this topic of art, of Carl Einstein as an art critic, and what he saw as the hopeless chasm between discourse and image. The relation of language to painting, wrote Michel Foucault, is an infinite relation. Neither can be reduced to the other's terms. It is in vain that we say what we see. What we see never resides in what we say. I don't expect that this will come as news to anyone in this room, least of all those of you in the MFA art writing program. Yet, as I hope to show this evening, one of the things that makes Carl Einstein such an interesting figure is the way this state of affairs defined his art theory and shaped his approach to art writing. Part of the challenge of applying language to painting lies in their fundamentally different semiotic constitution. In art criticism, insofar as it is concerned with works of figurative art, we have an encounter between two fundamentally different means of signification, linguistic and visual. Language is a system of units, of signs, and of socially shared conventions governing their use. The linguist Roman Jakobson, paraphrasing Charles Sanders Peirce, has described the system as the invariant behind numerous variables. By contrast, in the plastic arts, painting, sculpture, drawing, the artist does not have a pre-existing system of units or signs. Rather, art offers the potential of infinite variables without an underlying invariant. In a fundamental article published in 1969, the French semiotician Émile Benveniste argued that for this reason, painting and sculpture and related arts do not meet the criteria for a semiotic system. It is only through composition that the means of painting assume a signifying function. But it is ad hoc, unique to the particular artwork. Benveniste elaborated. The artist thus creates his own semiotics. He sets up his own oppositions and features which he renders significant in their order. Therefore, he does not have a repertory of signs recognized as such, nor does he establish one. Color, the material of painting, comprises an unlimited variety of graded nuances, of which none is equivalent to a linguistic sign. In contrast to language, which by its very definition is social and must conform to rules in order to be shared by a community, the artist, quoting Benveniste again, the artist freely sets up contrasts and values over which he assumes supreme authority. He answers to no one, nor must he eliminate contradictions. He must merely express a vision, of which the entire composition bears witness. Therefore, the meaning of art, unlike that expressed by language, may never be reduced to a convention accepted by two partners. New terms must always be found, since they are unlimited in number and unpredictable in nature. Thus, they must be redevised for each new work and, in short, proved unsuitable as an institution. It's the end of the quotation from Benveniste. I am pretty confident that Benveniste never read Carl Einstein, but his differentiation between the semiotics of language and that of painting, of a systemic, structural mode of signification versus a non-systemic, open-ended one, illustrates why Einstein saw in painting what he called an opening for human freedom. Painting, he fervently believed, had the potential to change human beings and refigure our image of the world. This is how he expressed the idea in an early text. A compelling art, he wrote, should be strong enough to transform, to organize persons and things in accord with the vision of its truth. For the picture is the painter's means for reshaping human beings according to the truth of his visual intuition. What Einstein demanded of art was nothing less than a radical transformation of human visuality and, by extension, of human subjectivity. Because visual art was not bound by a system of signification, it could be truer to the flux of reality and therefore harbored the potential for a continual refiguration of our image of the real. The very nature of language, on the other hand, its constitution as a system of fixed, conventional, iterable units, made it intrinsically conservative. It was, Einstein claimed, responsible for our inability to directly experience the dynamic flux of what he called the real. The rigidity of things, he wrote, is effected by linguistic habit. Language was a prison house, to borrow a metaphor from Frederick Jameson. As an art critic, Einstein was accordingly fiercely skeptical about language's capacity to describe art. There was, he claimed, a hopeless chasm between discourse and image. This aporia produced a distinctive approach to the writing of art criticism that I want to consider in this talk. But first, a few words about Einstein's biography. He was born in the German Rhineland in 1885. From 1904 to 1908, he attended university in Berlin, but never completed his doctorate. His earliest art criticism Oops. Oops. I'm going there. There. His earliest art criticism began to appear in 1910, but his first important work was literary, the novella Bygone, or The Dilettantes of the Miracle, completed in 1909 when Einstein was 24, although it was not published until 1912. In it, he sought to constitute out of words an experience of a visuality formed by Impressionist painting. His first significant work as an art critic was Negerplastik, published in 1915, the first book to be published in any language dedicated to the study of sub-Saharan art, sub-Saharan sculpture as art. It was not until the 1920s, however, that Einstein established himself as a major art critic, with his tome, The Art of the 20th Century, published in 1926 and in successively expanded editions in 1928 and 1931. In 1928, he moved from Berlin to Paris and was instrumental in founding the journal Document with Georges Bataille and Michel Leiris. His last publication on art, the quasi-monograph Georges Braque, appeared in 1934. It was while at work on that book that Einstein's hopes for the European avant-garde and his faith in his own critical project collapsed. He gave vent to this bitter disillusionment in a long, rambling 500-page book manuscript, The Fabrication of Fictions, unpublished in his lifetime. It's a searing critique of the avant-garde and of himself, which he saw as a privileged solipsistic elite striving to set itself above the masses. In the summer of 1936, Einstein set aside art criticism and left Paris for Barcelona, taking up arms with the anarcho-syndicalist militia of Buenaventura Durruti in the Spanish Civil War. Explaining his action to his friend, the art dealer Daniel Henri Kahnweiler, Einstein wrote, "Nowadays the rifle is necessary to make up for the cowardice of the pen." He remained in Spain throughout the duration of the war, returning to Paris early in 1939. As a German national, he was sent to an internment camp when the war broke out. Released along with other internees as the Germans launched the invasion of France in June 1940, Einstein fled on foot to southern France. Having found momentary refuge in a cloister, Einstein spoke to the abbot of having achieved a newfound clarity about his previous existence. He was, the priest recalled, I quote, "convinced that all of his artistic and intellectual efforts had been fruitless and that it wasn't worth prolonging a useless and wasted life." On July 5th, aged 55, Einstein committed suicide by drowning. So much by way of introduction. Now to my topic. My talk tonight will be in three parts. In the first, I will consider Einstein's art theory. In the second part, I will address how that theory affected his art writing. And I will conclude with some remarks on Einstein's art criticism from the perspective of today of what has been called the crisis of art criticism. Artworks engaged him, Carl Einstein wrote, only insofar as they comprise the means to modify the real, the structure of the human subject, and our conception of the world. They mattered only when they succeed in destroying reality and generating it anew. Most art, he argued, performed a conservative, calming function. It countered the anxieties provoked in us by the vital flux of nature and the inevitability of death, and it did so by providing images of order, duration, and stability, images that fixed and rationalized the dynamic flood of phenomena that assaults the senses. The abundance of surviving art from past eras only reinforced this conservative effect. These works were not merely objects of a retrospective art history, but active agents of past epistemic orders that everywhere hindered the transformation of our visuality and hence our direct, spontaneous experience of the real. Even in the 20th century, a major part of so-called modern art continued to serve this purpose. According to Einstein, it reinforced the inherited version of the visible world. Such art Einstein scorned as reactionary and life-diminishing, since it cravenly arrests what is past. A crucial term in Einstein's theoretical edifice is the German noun Anschauung. It has several meanings, but in the sense in which Einstein normally used it, it means intuition. Anschauung is a critical term in the epistemology of Immanuel Kant. It is a cognate of the verb anschauen, to look at, and although Kant uses Anschauung broadly for all sensory intuition, the word privileges the visual, and for the sake of clarity in my book, I've translated it usually as visual intuition. Although Einstein is fundamentally anti-Kantian, he nevertheless used the term in a modified Kantian sense while turning Kantian epistemology on its head. For Kant, intuition is the direct, spontaneous apprehension of concrete sense data in their singularity prior to their ultimate synthesis with comparable sensory events in the generalized abstraction of the concept. According to Kant, the concept is the precondition for cognition of objects. In contrast to the abstract generalizing concept, intuition is concrete and singular. It alone constitutes an immediate or unmediated apprehension of phenomena. What Kant calls the reproductive faculty of the power of imagination, which links each sense experience to our store of memories, to what has been previously seen or heard and cognized, sets limits to intuition, suppressing its concrete singularity. It therefore exerts an inhibitory conservative effect. Einstein decisively rejected the subordinate role that intuition plays in Kant's epistemology. What is spontaneously apprehended in visual intuition, a singular fragment of what Kant called the manifold, that is, nature in all of its unarticulated plenitude prior to signification, stands opposed to the concept. In art, Einstein argued, visual intuition was able to achieve autonomy. It was no longer mere raw material to be abstracted, generalized within the concept. Painting and sculpture could thus function as a critique of the prevailing visuality, a purely visual critique, in which Einstein claimed concepts as such need not come into play. Friedrich Nietzsche was a major influence on Einstein in his privileging of intuition, of Anschauung, of direct, spontaneous visual experience, and his hostility to the concept echo Nietzsche's brilliant early essay on truth and lying in an extramoral sense. The concept, Nietzsche wrote, is born by overlooking what is individual and concretely real, rendering as equal what is not equal. Human subjects, he lamented, do not allow themselves to be carried away by sudden impressions, by intuitions. They universalize those impressions into less colorful concepts. This great edifice of concepts, Nietzsche declared, is the gravesite of intuitions. Einstein fully shared this view. Like Nietzsche, he equated the homogenizing effect of the concept, and therefore of the word, with the loss of the uniqueness of direct experience, and thus with a disenchantment and impoverishment of the world. The visual artwork that was faithful to the spontaneity and singularity of intuition had the potential to be wholly new, unmediated, and unconstrained by concepts, by a system of fixed iterative signs. The complex rupture of the artwork with what was previously seen and known was defined by what Einstein called totality, a difficult but absolutely fundamental concept in his art theory. He deployed this term idiosyncratically. In Western philosophy, totality has been traditionally associated with holism. Yet as used by Einstein, the term signified its antithesis. For him, totality was identified not with coherent collective entities, but with singular, hermetically self-complete entities, individual, formally autonomous works of visual art. Yet in Einstein's theory, this autonomy is not identified with asceticism. It has nothing to do with art for art's sake. It is a necessary condition of art's power to transform the human subject. Because the totalized artwork is radically autonomous, extrinsic to the world as given, it militates against any illusion of wholeness, any sense of temporal continuity or causal connectedness with that world. Thus, the internal totality of the artwork makes it an agent of disruption, of disorder, a weapon directed against the conventional illusory order of the world. To be effective, the artwork had fully to take possession of the beholder, temporarily shutting down memory and extinguishing the sense of self. Einstein writes, it effaces all qualities that are not subordinated to the new sensation. He sometimes compared the effect to hypnosis or anesthesia. For him, this was not nihilism. Negation says absolutely nothing, declares a character in his novella Bygone. Affirmation just as little. The artistic begins with the word otherwise. But in this same passage, Einstein goes on to lament, we are entrapped by memory, dependent on tautologies. Totality, by shutting down memory in any sense of temporal continuity, created the possibility of a visual world that was radically otherwise. Let me say a word about the disruption of temporal continuity. An essential aspect of Einstein's theory of totality is the principle that our subjective experience of time is not quantitative, measurable in identical units, but qualitative. And in this, he was undoubtedly influenced by Henri Bergson's early book, Time and Free Will. This is a crucial element in Einstein's attitude toward language. True to the instantaneous nature of intuition, for the artist, totality does not produce a stable visuality, a system of repeatable forms. It is self-complete yet temporary and fugitive. Here I see a probable debt to the late 19th century German art theorist Konrad Fiedler, a brilliant author all too little known in the Anglophone world. For Fiedler, artistic activity, I quote, exhausts itself in every single moment in order to begin anew in the moment that follows. So the work of art is just a product of this continual process, just a sort of offshoot. Joseph Beuys sounded like Fiedler when he called the work of art a waste product. Einstein held that totality can begin at any moment. It enables us to see our experience as a whole at any given point. It is a densely layered, self-complete simultaneity. It absorbs temporal experience into a timeless present, what Bergson called a qualitative multiplicity. The fleeting, momentary nature of totality removes it from any chain of causality or repetition, ensuring its autonomy, singularity, and discontinuity with conventional reality, and it offers an opening for human freedom. Language requires the condition of iterability, discrete, repeatable signs, and systemic stability to function. We would not be able to communicate if words were not repeatable, and yet Einstein believed that this very sine qua non of language ensured its inadequacy as a medium for signifying the real. The iterative nature of words, indeed repetition tout court, Einstein argued, generated the illusion of the immortality of things. It endowed them with a semblance of stability and durability, when in truth, all was in continual flux. Repetition then was a deadly bulwark against radical change. Needless to say, the failure of language vis-a-vis the flux of reality extended also to the relationship between word and pictorial image. Einstein was scornful of description. Any description, he argued in an early fragment, cloaks the artwork with a web of concepts. Seeing, he wrote, knows only its own works. Language condenses all this heterogeneity into a concept. How then to write about art without violating its very nature? His goal, Einstein explained, was to determine how the formal constructs of art, I quote, approach our own state of mind, that is, how they fit into a pre-existing image of the world and into our own life, or how they contradict it, unsettle it, or influence it. He sought to identify the visual intuition that generated the form, to evoke the visual character of a body of work, avoiding any impression that he was somehow offering a verbal equivalent, what he sometimes called a paraphrase of a unique concrete visual experience untranslatable into language. And now I want to talk about his art writing. As a writer on art, Einstein abounds in paradox. Pithy, brilliantly turned phrases and sentences flow into what can seem a formless stream of redundancies, generating an effect of logorrhea. That's how Bill Rubin described it referring to Einstein's book on Georges Braque. It's easy to agree with the French art historian Georges Didier Huberman when he characterizes Einstein's style as, and I quote, at once dazzling and suffocating. Dazzling in the relentless eruption of violent and paradoxical formulations always delivered like frontal blows. But the blows rain down so, the dazzling features flow into one another in such a rhythm that the writing becomes suffocating, seizing us by the throat, wearing us down. And so it does, especially if you're translating it. Yet these very qualities could be seen as Einstein's tactical weapon in a war of attrition waged against resistant readers, as though by aggressive repetition, by a barrage of brilliant phrases and striking aperçus, he could compel us to see these pictures as he does, to believe in their power to refigure the world. But wait, didn't I say a moment ago that repetition was anathema to Einstein? Indeed I did. But I think there may be a reason for Einstein's penchant for repetition. Paradoxically, a marshalling of language to undermine the authority of language, a deployment of redundancy to expose the inadequacy of words, driving out the devil with Beelzebub, so to speak. One of the strongest examples of this, I believe, is the chapter on Cubism in his The Art of the 20th Century. But before I discuss how he wrote about Cubism, let me say something about his interpretation of it. Einstein's interpretation of Cubism might at first strike anyone familiar with the early literature on Cubism as boringly familiar, a rehashing of what by 1926 had become the cliches of early Cubist criticism, largely discredited today. The simultaneous representation of multiple viewpoints, the condensation of time into space, the primacy of the mental image over the optical one, the realist nature of Cubist art. All of these elements are present in the pre-war commentary of the French critics, and they also appear in Einstein's Cubism chapter, but with a unique, radically different twist. I would argue that most of the prominent early advocates of Cubism, Maurice Raynal, Daniel-Henri Kahnweiler, Jacques Rivière, to name a few of the more prominent ones, whatever their merits and differences, could be said to have tamed Cubism, making it seem less daunting by arguing that ultimately it was a realist art that could be reconciled with our existing knowledge of objects, with their familiar images in our minds. Kahnweiler called them memory images. Einstein, however, argued that Cubism's greatest achievement was that it destroyed our memory images. Cubism impressed upon us that the world in our seeing could be otherwise. At its most radical in the paintings of 1910 to 12, Cubism looked like nothing we had ever seen or thought. Although Einstein's interpretation has its blind spots and may be flawed as an explanatory model, It is arguably the only early writing on this art that does justice to the radical implications of Cubism as painting that had the potential to alter not only our conception of art, but our intuition of the visual world. He fervently believed that Cubism could be a model for refiguring our own seeing, not that the world would appear to us like a Cubist painting, but by impressing upon us that our seeing can be an open process, a creative act that we could see differently. And one might say that such paintings as these are literally indescribable. They present us with visual forms that are nameless, beyond existing verbal signification. Judged by the norms of conventional expository prose, Einstein's Cubism chapter in The Art of the 20th Century can seem irritatingly, extravagantly redundant. Reading it, one may wonder, how can he craft such finely chiseled sentences and yet apparently be so negligent of the discursive structure of his text? I became acutely conscious of this in the process of translating him. As examples of this penchant for redundancy, here I show you 4 formulations of his account of Cubist practice that appear over the course of 5 pages. The final 2 are on the same page. They are saying basically the same thing when one would think a single well-crafted formulation would do the job. Given that Einstein's text was nearly 4 times longer than was stipulated by his contract, it would surely be mistaken to see such extensive repetition as padding. He wasn't being paid by the word, and the book was way overdue. Laboring over the translation of this long chapter, I became exasperated by such redundancies. Yet eventually, I began to wonder whether these might be interpreted not as the result of authorial negligence on Einstein's part, but as springing in part from his convictions about the limits of language. These redundancies, I came to believe, could be understood as attempts to undermine any inclination to accept a single description of Cubism as adequate to its object. In effect, the multiplicity of formulations, the redundancies, serve to relativize any single verbal account, to locate the intuitive visual experience of Cubism beyond the reach of language. This is essentially what I wrote in my introduction to the Cubism chapter of my book. But in preparing this talk, I came up with a further thought, which is not incompatible with this explanation, but I believe augments it. As I have said, Einstein's text generally defies the conventions of expository writing, of discursive logic, and logic for him was a bête noire, a case of causal thinking that was incompatible with his principle of totality. I'm now inclined to believe that the occurrence of redundancies in Einstein's text, as if he had no memory of what he had written before, constitute textual equivalents of totality, instances of discrete, self-complete experiences of Cubism, isolated in time. The second example I want to cite is Einstein's Picasso text for the 3rd edition of The Art of the 20th Century, which appeared in 1931. It was the longest he had yet written on a single artist, to be surpassed only by his book Georges Braque, which appeared 3 years later. Although this long Picasso section, by far the largest single textual component of the entire book, about 10% of it, is rich in insight and offers many trenchant formulations, it can at times seem shapeless, riddled with non sequiturs, and maddeningly redundant. In this respect, it's similar to how Picasso himself later described his art to Françoise Gillot. He wasn't, I'm quoting Françoise Gillot, supposedly quoting Picasso, he wasn't promoting the idea of a rational line of thought, one which goes from deduction to deduction, from one principle to its inevitable consequences. My own thought in doing a painting is often a continuous non sequitur, a series of jumps from one mountain peak to another. It's what you might call a somnambulist's thought. Picasso's words could serve as an apt characterization of Einstein's text on him in much of his writing on modern art. In this 1931 text, with its revised account of Picasso's creative process, Einstein puts much less emphasis on the phenomenology of perception than he did in his Cubism chapter from 1926. Yet here too, there seems to be a relationship between the content of Einstein's text and the writing of it. In this case, it might be construed as consistent with the critique of fixity that is threaded throughout the text. As we have seen, a recurrent topos in Einstein's writing is the claim that fixity is a product of the rigidity of language, of linguistic signs, a distortion of direct visual experience. A passage in his essay, Methodological Aphorisms, published 2 years earlier, goes straight to the point. Quote, "When identified seeing with the immutable objects that are most often its content, signified by fixed, unchanging words, these objects had been rendered non-functional." Perhaps Einstein wished to avoid any single definitive formulation that could become a substitute for Picasso's paintings. Such an interpretation finds some support if one compares the 1928 and 1931 versions of the Picasso text. While the latter introduces new themes, in most of its substance it is identical, yet rarely in any sentence is any sentence identical to the wording in the earlier version. Rather than a tactically structured exposition, the text is a tissue of ideas in a continual state of metamorphosis. And here, to illustrate this point, I want to cite this one passage from the 1931 chapter in my translation and show it side by side with the ones that are highlighted as you see. He carries over, but every sentence is different. I'll just read the sentence in English. The visions of the gifted person differ from the shapeless dreaming of the ungifted in that, due to the acute isolation of the hallucinatory interval, they offer means to free figuration. The ordinary and sluggish person, should he encounter the elemental forces of being, lapses into a degenerate, formless angst, whereas the gifted one dreams with precision. He does not cravenly subject those dreams to quotidian reality, but further shapes them. And this is how he's writing about Picasso's later art of the later 20s. Although the content in the two editions is essentially the same, no two sentences are identical. And this is basically true throughout most of the chapter. In the three editions of The Art of the 20th Century, Einstein names specific works by artists, although he almost never describes them. When he does, it's with a terse sentence or two. Einstein, the champion of intuition, who privileges the singularity of each visual experience, nevertheless generalizes when it comes to verbalizing the experience of works of art. But in his last publication on art, Georges Braque, he went even further. In the opening paragraph of the book, Einstein formulates the phrase from which I've taken the title of this lecture. Here's the statement in context. One imagined that what was seen could be fully rendered in words, and numbed by the din of one's own barking, failed to see the hopeless chasm between discourse and image. These coiffeurs of description, so fond of metaphorically embellishing a Cézannesque blue or paraphrasing an Ang green, fail to grasp that words can never adequately or faithfully translate an optical experience. This demonstrates the embarrassing pointlessness of lyrical description. Effete word décorateurs exploit pictures instead of letting pictures conquer their own biased seeing. So one debases oneself as the illustrator of another's creation, instead of primarily using pictures like any other material to form one's own intellectual position. A few paragraphs later he adds, "We won't attempt to describe the exceptional work of Braque, nor to imitate his forms, his hues, and his mandolins and words, speaking and painting, each has its own way. Einstein keeps his word, and how. Not only does he not make any attempt to describe Brock's works, with the exception of the artist's recent illustrations to Hesiod's Theogony, he doesn't once refer by title to any of the 100 works illustrated in the book. And the very name of Brock is absent for long stretches of the text, turning Einstein's formulation on its head. One is tempted to conclude that Brock has been reduced to being the illustrator of Einstein's textual creation. And now, to my conclusion, I want to talk about Einstein in relation to the so-called crisis in art criticism. I'd be curious whether you people who are in the art writing program think there is such a crisis. But I found this text an interesting way of sort of reflecting on Einstein as a critic. As I was preparing this talk, I reread Jim Elkin's little pamphlet, that's what he calls it, from 2003, What Happened to Art Criticism, and his recent brief update, Art Criticism is Too Easy, for the New Art Examiner from just over a year ago. Those of you in the MFA program here are probably familiar with these texts. I'd be curious to hear what your take is on them. These are but two of many recent texts on the ostensible crisis in art criticism. What Elkins understands by art criticism is primarily, but not exclusively, writing that is tied to temporary exhibitions. He opens his book by declaring, art criticism is in a worldwide crisis. It is practiced more widely than ever before and almost completely ignored. He succinctly states the problem in his recent article. I quote, art critics had turned from judging, which they did since the Greeks, to describing, evoking, and praising. In support of this claim, he cites a Columbia University Arts Journalism Survey of North American art critics, in which, and here I quote Elkins, a majority of the country's top critics thought that a critic's job is to describe and not to judge. As a critic, Einstein practiced at a vastly different moment. It should be clear from what I have said that he most definitely did not think it his job to describe or to praise. But his position on judgment is complicated. He was critical of judgment and the privileged place it holds in Kant's aesthetics. He wanted to purge aesthetics of judgment. Why? Because judgment assumes that there are criteria, laws, and principles of art making that precede artistic creation. Therefore, the artwork will always be judged according to what has come before. All principles are necessarily a posteriori. They therefore cannot be the basis of judging, let alone creating what is radically new. Judgment is incompatible with Einstein's idea of totality. And yet, his criticism is deeply judgmental. This is especially evident in his massive survey of 20th century art, which, as I have mentioned, appeared in 3 successively larger editions between 1926 and 31. As he was at work on the first edition, he wrote to Kahnweiler, my art history will be embarrassing for some of the greats. It will, he predicted, be a wicked thing for all kinds of people. One French reviewer aptly remarked that as a history of modern art, it was more destructive than reconstructive. Einstein would not only have agreed, he seemed to relish that image. In the book, he registered the limitations and failings in the work of almost everyone he wrote about, from the Impressionists to the Russian avant-garde. In his longest chapter on the Germans, he was especially brutal. This wasn't gratuitous nastiness on Einstein's part, nor were his judgments based on purely aesthetic criteria. He would have been contemptuous of Clement Greenberg's dictum that, quote, you cannot legitimately want or hope for anything from art except quality. As we have seen, Einstein had passionate, radical convictions about the function of art and accordingly about the primary task of contemporary art. He judged everyone, or almost everyone, according to the degree to which they satisfied that criterion. Einstein's understanding of his critical practice fit the model of art criticism formulated by his older contemporary Albert Dresdner. His book, Die Kunstkritik, ihre Geschichte und Theorie, Art Criticism, Its History and Theory, was the first study to examine art, it appeared in 1915, was the first study to examine art criticism historically. In contrast to today's hand-wringing about the crisis of art criticism, Dresdner believed that in his time, art criticism despite considerable hostility toward it, had achieved an unprecedented influence, that it was a kingmaker. That was his term. He was interested in defining the place of art criticism in relation to both art and art history, and he defined it as a hybrid with elements of both. But it had a third element, which was unique to it, what he called the political element. That is that, I quote him, "The task of art criticism is not exhausted in the knowledge and evaluation of contemporary artistic production, but also aims at influencing artistic development." Significantly, this is not one of the cures Elkins considers for the purported crisis in art criticism. Understandably so. In our postmodern Babel, such conviction about the future course of art seems irretrievably a thing of the past. It would require a degree of conviction that Einstein himself could not sustain. Early in 1934, my last slide. Early in 1934, about the time his Georges Braque appeared, he subjected himself to a brutal self-reckoning. Describing himself, he wrote, the perpetual phony revolutionary becomes utterly sterile and remains hopelessly behind the times, hopelessly behind the changing conditions of the times, because he is always fighting for the same revolutionary utopia which he hopes to achieve by a change in artistic form. A year later, in his manuscript, The Fabrication of Fictions, he offered a sad, sober, retrospective reflection on his critical project. I quote, "Tragicomic, we develop ideas, spin fairy tales, or paint pictures, yet we're the first to be duped by our works. Artists will never make major history. The modernist enterprise will die out since it lacks living material. In former times, art served modestly to solidify conventions and defend important shared values and human standards. Today's modernism will fade away, for it lacks norms and social commitment. This art will perish in autistic over-refinement and playful isolation." Thank you. This is a way in which Einstein's study of African art and ethnology, which around 1920, he knew virtually nothing about African art when he wrote Negaplastic. But he immerses himself in the ethnological literature, and he was actually engaged with an anthropologist at the British Museum, Thomas Athol Joyce, in the right after he finished the first edition of his book. He went to London, and they were going to write what would have been the first history of African art, sharing the task. It wasn't divided by art history and ethnology. They took different geographical areas. The model of African art became a sort of model against which he measured modern art. That it was collective, that it was anonymous, that it had a function in the society. And he uses the phrase in 1926, the urgent need for a collective form in modern art. And Einstein creates this myth in the late 20s of what he calls primitivization, in which he begins to see modern artists, particularly Picasso, Klee, the surrealist, as working out of hallucinations and so forth that links them with primitive artists. I mean, that he's influenced by Jung, he's influenced by Lucien Lévy-Bruhl, the anthropologist, and so forth. So, and he did a show in New York in 1931 of ancient bronze statuettes, and that's the first time in print. It was published in English, the first time in print where he begins to show some sort of doubts about modern art, of looking at this art, that it was something that basically was integrated in the community, and as he says in that last quote, it's basically serving and corroborating and reinforcing the values of a society. And in The Fabrication of Fictions, he comes to see this art, modern art, as basically serving an elite it's serving capitalism, and it's like the scales fall from his eyes. It's really quite brutal. And then he goes to Spain the year after he finishes that draft, and he writes to Picasso. He's in this anarchist militia of Buenaventura Durruti. Durruti dies quite soon after Einstein gets there, but Einstein fought in the Spanish Civil War till the end, the beginning of 39, and he wrote to Picasso and toward the end of the Spanish Civil War that working with these workers and fighting alongside these workers and peasants was the greatest experience of his life. So I mean, he's really in search of this kind of collective society. He believed, it was a desperate sort of belief early on, that modern art could create this, as he says, through a change of artistic form. He could create a revolutionary utopia. But when he fell pretty hard. But it's a remarkable narrative of, as he said, to take up the rifle and get rid of the cowardice of the pen. I hope I've answered your question. His ignorance of African art when he wrote Negoplastic is what allowed him to embrace it as an ideal of totality. He says things in there which are completely wrong. He says, for example, of the African sculpture, it will never mingle in life. I mean, nothing could be further from the truth. He is analyzing according to pure form, and he creates this. There's a particular line which I think is really important in that book, where he says, first of all, he's saying that all of these sculptures are of the god. Not a single one of them, turned out not a single one of them was of a god. But that it's an autonomous object which exists as a being. It's an animist thing. And it is in no way contingent and in no way is oriented to our looking at it. And he sees the mass in a similar, he uses this term fixed ecstasy. But the section, which is the last chapter of the book on the mask, is I think the one that's most important for his later writings, influence under the spell of surrealism, because he begins that chapter talking about the mask and scarification and tattooing as the alteration of the individual body to collectivize it, and the transformation of one's own body. This is something he will write in surrealism about this, and he will also argue that Braque's and Picasso's paintings are in fact animist works. There's a remarkable passage, unpublished text from the 30s. As I said, his last publication on art is 1934, and he says that the African sculptor, according to Einstein, identifies representation and being. What is represented is the real. This is what he says of African art in Negoplastic. It's not abstraction. Artists look at it as abstract. It's not abstraction, it's reality. And Einstein believes that, he says, when representation was separated from being, art lost its power. That one ceased to believe that artworks were spirits, that art lost its power. So it's a remarkable thing of the way that people talk about, how we, quite rightly, how we westernized African art, the whole primitivism thing. And Hal Foster, a memorable phrase in reviewing the MoMA show, said, primitivism is the denial of otherness. Well, what Einstein tries to do in the late 20s is to other Western art and to elide the distinctions between it and these collective societies. And his idea was, without getting too complicated, his idea was that while we no longer had a collective society, that through yielding to hallucinations, artists like Picasso, Masson, Miro, so forth, as he interpreted them, were tapping into a collective unconscious. I think it's very clear he was influenced by Jung. And and that in this collective unconscious, we were tapping into forms that had a resonance for all human beings. And this became for him the way that a formally innovative and difficult art like modern art could reach the masses, because it was tapping into sexual forms. And so that was a really important idea. So it's somewhat long-winded, but I hope I responded to your question. Thank you for the question. Yeah. I realize I was told to repeat the questions because you don't have mics for the video, and I'm not doing that. I've been very bad. Well, the fact is that it can't, and he came to realize that. I mean, it was a pipe dream, and as I said, he was desperate. The way that I see Einstein, he was a person who had an acute aesthetic sense and felt somewhat guilty about it, and he. To be meaningful, art had to have a collective, had to be collectively meaningful, and so I think this is why his encounter with surrealism. He reads Freud, but as I said, everybody talks about Freud in relation to Einstein, and almost no one talks about Jung. And I think Jung is really the right thing. And the famous or infamous review that Jung wrote, the Picasso exhibition in 1932, which has been anthologized. I think he's read Einstein in 31. It's very similar, although he condemns Picasso. But Einstein never spells out exactly how this is going to happen and what kind of political structures are going to come out of it. He's always vague about that, and I think the very vagueness is what allowed him to sustain the belief for so long. By the time when he joins the Spanish Civil War, he gives an interview and he says, art has no use in this kind of age. It's escapism, it's cowardice. So he really becomes, just sort of rejects the whole thing. So I hope I've answered that. I think that it did in two cases, and I've written about that in one case. Georges Braque, the Braque book is a weird book because Braque has become estranged from Picasso, and so he writes about Cubism, and he never mentions Picasso. He mentions Braque, but he reads Braque in a totally new way than he had in 31. Where Braque represents tradition and classical equilibrium, and reads Braque as if he were Picasso. That it's a good thing he didn't describe these things. You're looking at still lifes and you're talking about demons and hallucinations. It doesn't fit. But Braque begins to talk. He gives interviews in their texts that become Einsteinian, and these theogony illustrations, which illustrate the book, his art takes on this biomorphic, very much like André Masson, the sort of biomorphic forms. The other case, which I believe, and something I wrote a longish article on, is Ernst Ludwig Kirchner. Einstein had nothing good to say about German artists except for Paul Klee, and he could make a case for Paul Klee because Paul Klee fit into his sort of myth of modern art. But Kirchner, he just had a response to Kirchner, which you can go and see at the Neue Galerie and see why. I think his response to Kirchner was correct. And Kirchner does this weird, Kirchner reads this book, at first he hates it, and then he writes to one of his promoters, Will Groman, and he says, oh, Einstein is the only one who's worth anything. And because Einstein is arguing in the 26th book that Cubism is the art of the present and future, Kirchner's art takes this weird Picassoid turn around 27, 28, and starts doing Cubist thing. And so it's my contention, because Kirchner was obsessed with being recognized and felt he was underappreciated, that Einstein's writing has that effect. There's also another factoid that emerged only a few years ago, and that is when Picasso had his largest retrospective to date at the Galerie Georges Petit in Paris in, I think it was June and July of 1932. he asked Einstein to help him with the installation. And then he later curated the Brock show. But so I think he had quite a bit of influence on other critics. But so it's a good question. And so I think in those two cases, I would say most definitely the evidence is that he did have an effect on the artist. So the effect that negroplastic had on the reception of African sculpture?
And if there were any responses to it?
Yeah, and then the other about judgment. Well, as I said, it was the first book that was published. There was one that was written earlier, but wasn't by Markov, who was a Russian, which was published posthumously in 1919. It had an influence on artists. The first edition was 12,000 copies. It sold out, and there was a second edition, 1920. It's cited by artists. It's rarely cited in ethnography because he didn't know what he was talking about. I mean, but we were having a discussion at the Met yesterday about this recent acquisition by Leonard Lauder for the Met of a 1908. Late 1908 Picasso, and we got into this whole discussion of African art, the reception of African art, and so forth. There was an exhibition in 1913 in Berlin that was Picasso with African sculpture. And on the cover of the catalog was an African mask, not an Einstein. And so it was one of the themes that emerged from the discussion is that I think a way of one of the questions was, how do we show this work? And my own opinion is that you don't get into this old game of was Picasso influenced by this, that, or the other, but that these two things were linked together. And I think that the linking of African art with modern art became, certainly increased a public for African art that became a sort of valorization of African art. And I think that's an important story to tell, which goes beyond the Bill Rubin affinities and all the rest of it. These are historical facts. These things were shown together, and it greatly expanded. In New York, the Marius de Zayas is showing these Stieglitz. And so I think this association, and these artists were also responding to, and Picasso was buying these objects, were very, very important. And what Einstein does in his 1921 book, which is very neglected because it's too boringly ethnographic for people, is he says it's time to integrate African art into the history of art. And that he proposes he's going to do it with this little book. And what he does is not to try to construct a narrative of African art, because he says we don't have the evidence, but to show its historicity, that things change. And that was a radical position to take. The racist ideology of the time, which referred to, in Germany, referred to Africans as Naturvölker, people of nature, contrasted with Kulturvölker, people of culture, is that Africans do not have a history. And so this book and others like it, I mean, and this identification, I think, are essential to the reception of African art and incorporating it into the canon of world art. Your second question was about judgment, and could you?
If he proposed an alternative to.
An alternative?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, as I said, he does judge. He judges brutally. I mean, there's an amusing anecdote that a sculptor, Ernesto de Fiori, when the first edition of The Art of the 20th Century came out, physically, who got a very bad write-up in Einstein's book, physically attacked Einstein with his own book, beating him over the head with it. So he does judge, And he judges, but as I said, he doesn't judge individual works. He doesn't say, oh, this Picasso is better than that one. He rarely references individual works. What he is judging is whether the artist is basically changing the visual world. And the artists who were really, it's a very small canon. There's Picasso, there's Braque, to a lesser extent Juan Gris and Léger, Paul Klee, Joan Miro, with whom he became good friends, and that's pretty much it. These are the people. André Masson also. These are the artists who are, I think, are changing human subjectivity. It's such a radical vision. I've worked on this book forever. I thought I would never finish, and now I wanted a divorce from Carl Einstein. My wife, I think, wanted a divorce from me from hearing about this guy. We got married the same year I started working on the project. And now that I've finished this book, I'm beginning to find him interesting again. So I really appreciate the opportunity to give this talk tonight. He was, there are basically two moments. There's 1819, at the end of the war, when there's the so-called German Revolution. And Einstein is very active in that. He speaks at the funeral of Rosa Luxemburg. And he's writing with George Gross in a couple of short-lived radical periodicals. Blutige Ernst, one of them. And so John Hartfield, George Gross, and so he's doing this, but not writing about. He never writes about Dada art. He has no, and he's pretty estranged from modern art at that moment. And then something happens, and he's most preoccupied with African art. He's writing the second book that comes out in 1921, and then politics disappears from his writing totally throughout the 20s, and it's only in 31 in the Surrealism chapter, which is a new chapter in his book, that he begins to talk about a crisis of Western intellectual, that it is estranged from the rise of this industrial proletariat, and that it's a question, do you sort of bourgeoisify this culture? It may create a new culture. Something we don't have the full story on, but which is quite interesting, and I have my own theories about it, is that after, in 1933-34, he works with Jean Renoir on Jean Renoir, the filmmaker, the great French filmmaker Jean Renoir, who was a leftist, and Jean Renoir invites Einstein to work to write a scenario on this film about guest workers in southern France. Yeah. And it fell apart. Einstein is not listed in the credits. We don't know exactly what happened, and I don't think Einstein would have had any idea of how to write. I mean, it was a complicated thing, and it was a talkie. But the way I read that film is that it coincides with Einstein's disillusionment with the avant-garde in painting, and he had been contemptuous of film. He said, people coming out of a cinema are embarrassed. It's like they're being seen coming out of a brothel. Or when you go to the cinema, you check your hat with your brain. He hated film. He was contemptuous. He wrote nasty things about Sergei Eisenstein. But in 34, here he is working in a film about guest workers with amateur actors. And I see this as Einstein basically abandoning his elitist beliefs and embracing this medium. When he was in Spain, and we know very little about this, he was trying to make a film about the Spanish Civil War that comes through in a letter to Kahnweiler. So anyway, the 30s, there's so much.
But no, you never hung out with Trotskyist groups?
No. He was, yeah, go back to your original question about Marx. He was evidently, briefly a member of the German Communist Party, which was just founded in, I think, January of late December 1918, early 19, by Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg. He's writing these radical political articles, but by the 30s, he's contemptuous of Marx. And Marx it's like imposing this order. It's this, it totally goes against his interest in the unconscious and the hallucination. So Marx is too dogmatic. It's too dogmatic for him. It just mentioned in the letters, we really don't know. And looking at Tony, and some important parts of Tony are lost, but some people have, there's a brilliant German film critic who tried to make a case of seeing, elements of Einstein and that. For me, I think that's a fool's errand. But to me, what is significant is the nature of the film, which was a left-wing film with amateur actual workers playing themselves, and Einstein embracing a medium which he previously expressed contempt for, and that he does it after he has basically given up his hope in painting as having any kind of meaningful social agency. Well, you mentioned my October article, which deals with that. I mean, he and Benjamin has had totally different ideas. And I'll say this, for Benjamin, for me, Walter Benjamin, who is a magnificent writer, and if I were sent to a desert island and I was, so you can take either Einstein or Benjamin, I would take Benjamin. But he's a very logocentric thinker, and Einstein is not. And Einstein's position is the social agency of art, to the extent that it has agency, is in its visuality. And he was contemptuous of people like George Gross and Otto Dix. They're saying, left-wing content in right-wing form, because they were traditional. And it was only by changing our sensorium that art could be truly radical. The connection from that to different social forms, well, he never got into that little detail. So he writes a couple of things about it. I think he gets it all wrong. He got a lot of things wrong, but he always remained interesting in doing so. He writes about collage in the Brock book. In the end of the sixth chapter, which is dealing with cubism, he has like 2 pages on collage, and he just says, they're rejecting the traditional refinement of painting. He's not a person who's focused on medium specificity. He's very visual, and I think he had a sense of what was good and what was not, although I disagree with, like, he had contempt for Matisse. I think he missed the boat on that one. Because I think Matisse, I think Matisse, at least between 1911 and 1915, can change one's visual intuition in a quite radical way, in the whole way that one experiences space. But he was blind to that, and then of course he was also limited by what he could see. So, okay.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.